and probably get some pop-ups over there. And a second, Anna. I will spotlight over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody from Concordia University's Force Space, located on unceded Indigenous land in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. Good afternoon and welcome. At Force Space, every day something happens, and that something is directly linked to the research projects, various initiatives, and classroom activities at Concordia University, which leads me to today's event. Speaking of classroom activities, we are so pleased to be joining Peter Graham's class once again, happening live and in person at Concordia University's Loyola campus. For today's iteration of Perspectives on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we are joined by Rebecca Tittler, who will address SDG 15, Life on Land. And Rebecca will be focusing specifically on sustainable forest management and biodiversity loss, and Eric Pedersen, who will address SDG 14, Life Below Water, focusing specifically on effects of fishing and nutrient inputs on aquatic food webs as an example of how human impact can interact to change aquatic ecosystem. We're so looking forward to both of these presentations. And on that note, I'll pass it over to Peter if you want to say further welcome to your special guests.
Yes, thank you, Anna. We're very excited today to have Professors Pedersen and Tittler with us. They're both professors in biology, but as a social scientist, I think it's important to realize that when we think about how to produce sustainability people, we will need to look at ecosystems like forests and aquatic ecosystems as sort of our teachers. And so I'm just thrilled to have Professors Pedersen and Professor Tittler, who's actually the sort of heart and soul of Loyola College, with us today to share their research. So if you Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. All right. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to give this talk. So a bit of a background. I'm a professor in the Department of Biology. My lab studies changes in marine species, especially ones we fish, and how species interactions in the ocean. So what feeds on what eats what, determines how much we can sustainably harvest, how things like climate change are going to affect the makeup of the ocean. We also study how we can measure the ocean. Because one of the things that we run into when we're dealing with something as vast and deep and complex as the ocean is that just measuring what's there is incredibly difficult. If you go into a forest, you can count the trees, you can measure the soil. If you want to try and measure fish in the ocean, you first have to put down a net. You have to hope your net gets the right places. You have to make sure you're hitting the right spot. I've heard it put that, measuring fish in the ocean is a little bit like measuring trees in the forest. If you can't see the trees and you have to reach 400 meters down to get to them, and you don't know if you actually saw them or not. So it's a really difficult job trying to understand the ocean. And as such, trying to understand how we sustainably manage marine systems or aquatic systems is tricky. Oh, sorry, I think I'm hitting the wrong place. Sorry, too many computers in front of me. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about, first of all, what services do we depend on aquatic life for? So what does the ocean provide for us? Even beyond just the moral imperative to try and preserve life around us, what do we actually get as people from the ocean or from the water around us? We're asking, what are aquatic ecosystems? And how does life in the water differ from life on the land? How is it a fundamentally different way of life? And what do we need to know to understand that? We're looking at major threats to sustainable aquatic food webs. This includes terrestrial inputs, so things like pollutants or nutrients or plastics, as well as things like overharvest, so removal of too many fish from the ocean. We're talking about the effects of aquatic food webs and how different human impacts can have cascading effects on ecosystems. So it's not just one thing affecting an ecosystem at a time, how different things can interact and lead to complex results that we couldn't predict from what we first changed. Then we're talking a little bit about some potential solutions for protecting aquatic life going ahead and sustainably managing aquatic life. So aquatic life provides a wide range of services to life around us. So this includes things, you might have gone fishing. You might have, sorry, see if I got any laser pointer working. You might have gone fishing. You might have eaten, you will almost certainly have eaten seafood in the past. You might think of seafood as a relatively minor part of your diet, but there are places around the world where seafood is a huge fraction of the protein or one of the most important sources of food for them. So trying to protect aquatic life is one of the first things we think of. We think of food and we think of recreation. However, there's other major roles for aquatic life around us. So for instance, living things in water provide water filtration. So a lot of breaking down toxins, breaking down nutrients, making your water clear is in large part done by living organisms. In fact, in the city purification systems, one of the first steps they use for purifying water is putting it through an aquatic filter, through a set of living organisms that break down material first. So because organisms are really good at breaking things down, consuming material, recovering nutrients, we depend on them to be able to protect us from the things we put into the water. We see things like coastal protection. So this is an example of mangrove swamps, where the presence of these mangrove swamps can buffer coastal ecosystems from waves. They absorb the energy of the waves coming into them. They slow the water down in flooding situations, and they can protect the land from becoming either flooded at all or just reduce the severity of the flood. Or if we have things like wetlands in the areas around you, these wetlands can act like water batteries. So they can take up water that's pouring down and let it flow out slowly rather than flooding hard surfaces. So we've seen as we replace things like wetlands with things like concrete or pavement or parking lots, we've seen increasing risks of flooding. We no longer have these aquatic ecosystems that are acting like batteries. And then finally, there's things you might not even think of. There's the fact that the ocean is incredibly diverse. Life evolved first in the ocean. It's been in the ocean for 2 billion years longer than it's been on land. There's an incredible diversity of bacteria, of life, of animals, of plants that have all evolved to live in an incredibly complex environment, which means that they're an incredible resource for things like chemicals. So if you study biology at all, you almost have certainly heard of green fluorescent protein. This is a protein we use to study how cells change. We can use it to identify parts of cells, but it was first isolated from a jellyfish, and it's found in a wide range of marine organisms. So the presence of this biotic diversity is a huge resource that we risk losing without even knowing about it. As marine species go extinct or as we lose them, we're potentially losing huge amounts of genetic diversity that we never even knew we had. See if this actually changes. So human activities are having an increasing impact on aquatic life. We used to think of the ocean as a big blank spot that we could just throw things into. There was a saying back in the 70s that dilution is the solution to pollution, that if we just throw things into the water, they'll go away and we don't have to deal with them. We're very rapidly realizing that their capacity for our oceans to absorb these impacts is not nearly as large as we thought. I don't have time to talk about all the massive number of ways we're impacting the ocean. And you've probably at least heard of many of these and gotten potentially depressed about many of these. But just give you a sense of some of them. We're adding things like plastics. We're adding things like, we're acidifying the ocean through carbon dioxide. We're collapsing fisheries through overfishing or removing too many organisms. And all of these impacts have cumulative effects. So they interact and work together to in some cases make changes more quicker in different environments. Oh. Apologies for the lag on this. So how does life differ in the ocean from life on land? Let's see if it actually transitions. There we go. So when you think of the ocean, you might think of this big open expanse of open water, or you might think of a coastline or a shore. But oceans are incredibly heterogeneous and incredibly diverse. So there's a wide range of different environments, and organisms living in the ocean have had to adapt to a wide different range of situations. So it ranges from everything like rivers and lakes, so freshwater versus saltwater. There's things like coral reefs. So these are biomes that are shaped and created by organisms themselves. So the organisms are actually creating the environment they're living in, which in turn creates habitat for other organisms. There's places like the open ocean, which we call the pelagic, where organisms have to rely on the food captured by tiny plankton that just float in the ocean. There's coastal habitats like here. Let's see if this mouse works. Like here, where we see a huge amount of organisms that are exposed every day by the tide. So they have to survive both in dry land and wet conditions. And there's areas in the deep bottom of the ocean, the benthos, where organisms have to survive only on the energies that come from places like hydrothermal vents or the energy that falls from above. There's this huge range of different environments that these organisms have to adapt for. And how we're changing the environment is affecting all these organisms in different ways. And there's a few different challenges the organisms had to adapt for that you might not have thought about, or you might not be used to thinking about based on life on land. So the first is that water is a buffer and it's absorbing medium. So air also can buffer things. So air can spread temperatures out. You know, if you felt a breeze, it can move heat from one place to another. But water is much better at absorbing a large amount of heat and diffusing and spreading things like heat out. So if we look at the temperature, so this is the air temperature today in the area around Quebec. So this is from windy.com. This is a great website if you want to try and get a sense of large scale climate and how things vary. You can see, big patches of colder air around here. Then as we get to the coast, we find the air just all seems to flatten and level out. And this is in part because the ocean is absorbing heat more slowly than the air does. So it acts to moderate it. So while the air heats up during the day, the ocean heats up less, but will continue to absorb heat at night and then slowly release it back to the air. So the ocean moderates the temperature around it. It also does it for the ocean as well. So if you go deeper into the water, you find that things no longer are varying rapidly in temperature. So if an organism that lives in the bottom of the ocean might only experiencing 1 or 2 degrees range of temperature in the entire year, whereas we might experience 10 degrees temperature range in a single day. And just to give you an example of what the water temperature looks like, you can see it's a relatively homogeneous region. So over this pretty large spatial scale, we're not seeing huge fluctuations in temperature. So based on this scale, only about 4 or 5 degrees in surface water temperature. So what does this mean, this fact that oceans can buffer and absorb, that they can take in material, that they can spread it around? Well, first of all, it means that they're important climate regulators. So one of the major reasons that the CO2 is not rising as fast as humans have been putting it into the atmosphere is that the ocean has been absorbing a lot of CO2 from the air. And if this will actually change slides. Okay. So the ocean is absorbing CO2. But this also means that as it absorbs CO2, as it acts as this buffer and absorbing medium, and I really want to show this graph. There we go. So as the ocean is absorbing carbon dioxide on the left, it's also acidifying the ocean. So as it absorbs carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide breaks down, so it becomes an acidic form, so it actually lowers the pH of the ocean. Which means that organisms like coral reefs or organisms like mussels and clams that rely on calcium carbonate in the ocean, so they rely on taking calcium in to build their shells, are now starting to lose that ability to live. They're finding it harder to get the calcium they need because it's more acidic. And if the ocean keeps acidifying, there's going to be some areas where these organisms can't live at all. So they'll take more energy to build calcium shells than to maintain them. So they actually have to always keep putting energy into building the shells. So this means that the oceans are an important climate regulator, but also means that what we add to the ocean can linger for a long time. So the ocean can spread it out and disperse it, and it can cause it to linger over long periods of time. So for instance, if we stopped adding carbon dioxide right now to the ocean, it would keep absorbing CO2 for quite some time. It's going to keep acidifying. And that CO2 is going to linger in the ocean for a long period of time. So we can't count on just being able to immediately stop what we're doing and hope things go back to normal. The other thing about water is that it moves and flows. So you might be used to thinking about organisms living on land only being able to move on their own power or moving by things like the wind. But in the ocean or in rivers and lakes, water is a major motive force. Many organisms float in the water, they are transported to places, then they rely on ocean currents to take them over long or short scales. So you can get flows on short scales, like this river here, just moving a few organisms a few feet down over a waterfall. But we can also get water flows on incredibly large scales. So this is again from windy.com. This is showing the current state of ocean currents. So how rapid ocean currents are at different points of the North Atlantic. And it's a bit hard to see the scale here, but in the bottom right here, the pink spots show areas where the current is moving about 0.5 meter per second. So if you think about being drifted 0.5 meter per second as an organism constantly, you can see areas where there's potentially very large transport. So you can see the Gulf Stream here, in this spot here, that's transporting heat from the equator up to Europe. So this stream is one of the major reasons why, for instance, Paris has a nice climate, but St. John's is a terrible one, even though St. John's, Newfoundland is south of Paris. So these ocean currents are moving organisms, they're moving heat, they're moving resources throughout areas. As a consequence of this, it means that things we put in the water don't necessarily stay where we put them. This is a study from, this is information actually taken from an accidental study. So this was what are called the friendly floaties. These were little rubber ducks that were dropped off a shipping container, about 28,000 that dropped off a shipping container in 1999 or 1992, sorry. And then they drifted in the ocean. So they were lost around just outside of Hong Kong, in the Pacific, January 1992. And the red lines are showing the paths they're taking based on where we found them on ocean shores in the 15 years since then. And I think these are still being found. So these rubber duckies have just stayed in the water for over 15 years and are moving from places as far as from the Central Pacific all the way over to England and Ireland. So they've probably traveled, each one of these rubber ducks has probably traveled further than any of us in our entire lifetime and are probably going to keep traveling for a long time. So anything we put in the water is not going to stay in one spot. It's not necessarily going to fall to the bottom and just go away. It's not necessarily going to mix into the ocean. It's going to move and it's going to potentially concentrate in places. You notice we're not finding these rubber ducks everywhere on Earth. We're finding them concentrated in certain spots. So you might have heard of the Pacific garbage patch. This is when we're putting plastic pollution into the ocean. It's drifting and concentrating in areas where currents flow together. So we can't count on removing things or expecting things to spread out across the ocean. Instead, if we put something in the ocean, it's likely going to end up in certain hot spots, which are going to have bigger impacts. The third major difference for aquatic life is that aquatic ecosystems are very vertically structured. So things, when you walk through the forest, you might notice it being dappled or a bit darker. Or if you walk through a prairie, you might notice things lighter or a bit lighter or darker. But in the ocean, things like light, things like nutrients are incredibly spatially structured. So if you go below roughly 200 meters in the ocean, depending where you are, this will be shallower or deeper. You go around 200 meters, you get to the point where you have not enough light to photosynthesize. So any organisms living below this 200 meter mark have to be able to survive off of energy that's captured above them. So we call this upper area the photic zone, where we have light. Let's see if I'm getting a laser pointer. And we also have the benthos. So we have the bottom of the ocean where organisms that can't swim as effectively or don't have the energy to swim as effectively or don't have the buoyancy spend most of their life. So any organisms that's living in the bottom of the ocean that's far away from the photic zone has to rely on energy coming from above it. So it has to rely on nutrients and energy coming from the areas where the energy is being captured. And this means that the ocean has distinct zones, so areas where life works differently. So if we look at this as just a rough diagram where the red line indicates what's called the benthic zone, the bottom of the ocean. So this is just a rough sketch if you think about going from the coast all the way out to the deep water. Red line is the benthic zone. The yellow line represents where you no longer have enough light to photosynthesize to make up for the energy you spend on photosynthesizing. So it's below that yellow line in what's called the aphotic zone. It's no longer worth photosynthesizing. Let's see if this progresses. So we see the separation for photosynthesis versus no photosynthesis. And we have one place right on the coast. So this shallow area here in the top left, where light reaches the bottom of the ocean. This is the only place where you can have any organisms like kelp that can grow, that need light to grow and grow from the bottom. It's the only places we have anything that looks like even vaguely like the trees or plant life we're familiar with can only grow in this, what's called neretic zone. Or in lakes, we call it the littoral zone. So any organism that lives in the photic zone has to survive on, has to be able to float. So it's photosynthesized, it has to be able to float, it has to be able to stay in the water. And one of the consequences of this, if this advances, is also that we get separation of nutrients. So if we have the same separation of energy and location, we have new energy being captured at the top of the water here. And we have organisms, any organism that dies in the water that falls to the bottom is going to be removed. So any nutrients they contain, anything that life on the surface needs is going to get taken to the bottom. So you have this net flow of energy being captured on top, falling to the bottom, feeding the organisms there, and then a loss of nutrients. Because we don't really see much vertical mixing the water. So the water will mix a lot horizontally, but we don't see a lot of mixing up and down. So what falls to the bottom tends to stay there. So we find on the bottom, we find only this energy from falling dead organisms or organisms that weren't able to stay in the top. And we also see a net flow of nutrients. So we have not only energies coming from above and below, means that we get nutrients that tend to accumulate at the bottom of the ocean. So you have this separation where the top has a lot of energy, but very little nutrients. The bottom has a lot of nutrients. There's a lot of things that's fallen down there, but very little energy available. So organisms have to adapt to survive in these situations. And the only place where we see the combination of the two is typically along coastal zones or areas of what's called upwelling, where water will bring these nutrients from the bottom into the photic zone. So most of the energy that's being captured by the ocean is actually being captured in a fairly limited part of space. And we'll see if this map shows up. There we go. So to show the combination of this map shows areas where we have large amounts of chlorophyll, so large amounts of phytoplankton living. And you can see that there's huge areas of the ocean in blue here that are almost deserts. So they're deserts of the sea. They have huge amounts of light coming in, temperature's fine, everything's great. But there's so little nutrients that the organisms just can't survive there. Or they survive, but they only eke out a living. Whereas a huge amount of energy is being captured in these coastal zones. Notice there's a large amount of photosynthesis going on at the boundaries of continents where water is coming up from the bottom, bringing these nutrients and bringing light. So one consequence is this means that life on the bottom of the ocean can take a very long time to recover from disturbances. So these are plots, apology for the quality of the figure here, it looks better on this screen. But the plot on the left shows life on what's called a seamount. This is an undersea ocean. You can see it's diverse, it's thriving. It should be colorful, but it's not showing up well on this screen. And on the right, you see what happens after a bottom trawler has gone through this area. So after it's been swept by gear that is designed to capture fish, but also tends to tear up the bottom. And what the result is, we see this removal of a huge amount of life, and this life takes a long time to grow back. There's some areas where we estimate that could take a decade for the life to recover back to the level where it was after one fishing vessel has gone through. So even though we have an area that's very diverse, rich, it looks complicated, because it's slow growing, it means that any impacts we do will last a very long time. So this also means that what we do to the land, especially things we do to areas near the coast, can have a very large effect on the ocean. Because so much production occurs in these areas right at the coast, right by land, and because inputs of nutrients from land heavily impact how the ocean changes, when we do things like fertilize, we put things like fertilizer on the ocean, we put nitrogen in, well, nitrogen is it's a limited nutrient. So it causes these algal blooms. So in the figure on the right, you can see algal blooms in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, these large green clouds that can be, in one case, they're a source of food for fish, they're a source of food for animals. But they also, when they die, they'll remove oxygen from the water. So they fall, they remove oxygen. And remember, the things don't mix vertically, so that oxygen is not quickly recovered. So as they die and fall out, they can drain the oxygen from the water and actually kill organisms. So ironically, even though they're growing and releasing oxygen, they're actually killing organisms by removing oxygen from the water. Or they can produce toxins. There's many kinds of phytoplankton that can produce in large quantities toxins that can be hazardous to human or animal life. So by adding things like fertilizers in areas quite a ways downstream, we actually can lead to carry-on effects in areas all the way out in the open ocean. And just an example to show what this looks like. This is an experiment from what's called the Experimental Lakes area in Ontario. And this is an experiment to show the effect of adding nutrients to these lakes. This is one lake that was separated, it's the same lake on the left and the right, separated just by a curtain. The only difference was on both sides, they added nitrogen, and the right side, they added nitrogen and phosphorus. Lakes are otherwise identical, same temperature, same location, same history. And we can see just immediately, without even having to measure it, how different the lakes are, so how different this effect of nutrient inputs is. So in addition to these nutrient inputs, things like predators play an important role in ecosystems. So we're used to thinking about predators being a relatively minor part of our lives. Humans have realistically removed almost every major predator from the world or from the land, except in areas like Africa, where there are still a few large ones remaining. However, in the water, these large predators play an outsized role in affecting dynamics and changing how things work. So for instance, if you have a lake that doesn't have any large bass, it doesn't have any large, what's called piscivorous fish that eat other fish, you get abundant small fish, which eat a lot of zooplankton, which in turn lead to a lot of phytoplankton. On the other hand, if we have a case where we have top predators present on the right here, we now see they eat these small fish, which let the zooplankton increase, which drives down the small fish. And we can see the consequences of this by looking at another lake experiment. In this case, it's similar to the first case, except here, both cases, nutrients are added to both sides of the lake. But on the right side, they added nutrients and predators. So they added a largemouth bass that wasn't present in the lake previously, whereas on the left side, they only added nutrients. And again, you see this striking difference of a radical change where now you have this open blue lake with not very cloudy water, relatively high oxygen, better habitat for fish. On the left, you see this strong nutrient lake. And this kind of feedback can actually lead to these systems being stable regardless of which one they're in. So if things started in this green state, well, the green state will be toxic for fish. They'll have a hard time surviving. They can't invade, they can't increase, so they'll stay green. You start with a lake that's high in bass, they can keep the phytoplankton down, they can grow more bass, they can prey on those small fish. so they can keep the lake blue. So both of these are what are called alternate stable states. And what we do can cause the system to switch between them. So if you think about, say, if we're fishing this lake very heavily, we might be able to tip the balance from this blue lake to the green lake just by removing too many predators. So you might think of fishing as only removing the total number of fish. You might think it only affecting how many fish we can catch. But it can also have lead-on consequences to things like shaping the whole ecosystem. And this could actually in turn mean that overharvest can affect the whole ecosystem. So removing fish can affect how things function. For instance, you have a case here where if you have, this is from the Baltic Sea. And what we see here is if you have cod that feed on these small fish, which in turn can feed, say, things like penguins, murre. If the cod decrease too much, the ones they feed on, so the sprat that they feed on, will start preying on cod eggs. They'll increase in abundance, they'll start preying on cod eggs, and all of a sudden the cod can't increase. So now if we remove too many cod, we've switched the system, so we now no longer have a cod-dominated system, we have a sprat-dominated system, and even if we stop fishing it, it won't have a tendency to return to where it was. And there's also carry-on effects. So if we add things like nutrients, this can lead to a decrease in oxygen, which again negatively affects cod. The more phytoplankton improves sprat. So these combinations of us fertilizing the ocean and removing predators can have synergistic effects that can make everything substantially worse. So we can't just look at a single intervention at a time. We have to think about how multiple interventions might affect a system. And as a really amazing example that just came out just this year, this is a paper from Nature where they were looking at trying to estimate how much whales were eating of krill. So blue whales eating krill in the Antarctic. And what this plot is showing is that the whales they'll go up to the surface, they'll dive down, they'll eat krill from this dark red area in the middle, around 100 meters. Then they'll go back up to the surface. You can see on the right, you can show them they're defecating. So they're releasing feces and it's releasing iron into the water. And what they were finding was when they're estimating the amount of krill these whales were eating, they realized that if you looked at the number of whales that were alive at the start of whaling, about 100, 200 years ago, they were eating about 4 times the amount of krill that is currently in the Southern Ocean. So there's less, even though there's fewer whales eating less krill, there's less krill than there was 100 years ago. And what they're arguing, what they consider their hypothesis is that the whales are by moving iron back up into this top level, they're creating their own food. So they're releasing this iron, they're fertilizing the ocean, it's producing more phytoplankton, which feeds more krill. So if we're able to increase the abundance of whales, we might actually get more krill, not less krill. And this is just an example of how much they think that how big the change in the amount of iron recycled was based on species. I won't go dig into this too much, but on the right, you can see the lines for blue whales. So it's how much the amount of iron fertilized they predict, or the amount of iron being recycled changed in the presence or absence of blue whales. And this is measured in thousands of tons of iron per year being recycled back by whales into the upper ocean. So there's still a lot we don't know about the ocean, though. This is just giving you a brief summary of some of the things we do know. However, the number of unknowns we have about the ocean system are substantially greater than the number of knowns. So just give you a sense of the scale of our unknowns. This is a map from Labrador. It doesn't look very high resolution here. And it looks like the ocean on the right and the land on the left have pretty comparable resolutions. But if we zoom into a specific patch, so this is Google Maps, we zoom into a specific spot, we see on the left, the land has this detailed photo. So this is satellite imagery. It has, you can see valleys, you can see hills, you can see rocks and trees. On the right, you see flat land. So looking at just this as a satellite map, it looks like the ocean's flat and featureless. But if you went down there, you'd find oceans, you'd find trenches, you'd find hills, you'd find valleys. But what we run into is that we know only a tiny amount about the actual ocean itself. We actually have better maps of Mars than we have of the ocean floor. In fact, we have better maps of Mars than we have the ocean floor of the continental shelf around America and Canada. Substantially better maps. Like, I wish we had the Mars style maps. So there's a massive amount we don't know about this. And what we talked about today is only sort of the first grasp. So if we want to try and understand how we sustainably fish the ocean, we do need substantially more research on it, just to know what effects our actions will have. So what can we do to protect these ocean ecosystems? The first thing is trying to reduce human inputs. And the best advice that seems to be coming out is that we should be reducing inputs at the source. So we should be reducing the amount of garbage put in. You might have seen things like the Ocean Cleanup Project or some of these other efforts to scoop garbage out of the ocean. But the most concentrated place we're putting garbage, we're putting nutrients, we're putting wastes into the ocean is in our rivers and it's in our lands, it's in our landfills. So the place we actually have the easiest time protecting the ocean is ironically on land. And this just gives you a sense, this is a picture of a landfill. It gives you a sense of just the amount of plastic waste that can be in these landfills and there's in the open that then easily make its way into waterways. We can also advocate for more sustainable fisheries. So with fisheries, we don't only think about necessarily reducing the amount of fishing. It is important in some areas. There's some areas that we think are sustainably fished. We also need more research on gears. So what the kind of ways we're fishing the ocean. As we saw with the removal of areas of the benthic, different gears have very different impacts on the water. And different gears or different ways of fishing can affect the whole food web in different ways. So we need to advocate for more sustainable fishing practices. We also need substantially more research on what actually works for sustainable fishing. We are trying to protect areas of the ocean in the same way we're putting up national parks. I think Rebecca's going to talk a little bit about protected areas on land. We're building marine protected areas in the ocean. So these are areas that in concept are designed to protect sensitive marine areas, so areas where we think that there's going to be a high amount of impact. And Canada has been pretty proactive in trying to protect marine areas. So right now we protect 14% of our EEZ, so our exclusive economic zone, which spans out to 200 kilometers around the Canada's coast, which is actually, it beat the target that Canada was aiming for. It was supposed to be 10% by 2020. And it ended up being 14%. And Canada is claiming we're aiming for 30% protection by 2030. So we're trying to increase these. However, one of the things we're running into though, is that where we've been putting these protected areas is often not necessarily where we need the protection. So where the protected areas go is often a measure of negotiation between places like fishermen, between oil and gas industries, between the government. And often what we end up protecting is areas, well, like here in the very far north, where there's no current fishing or resource extraction, or there might be shipping through there at some point. So we have this huge protected area in the north where we don't right now need it. Or we have areas like, it's kind of hard to see, but around the southern part of St. John's, around Newfoundland, where we have a protected area that's very carefully carved out every area that's economically significant for fishing or for oil and gas. So it's ended up protecting a pretty big barren part of the ocean. So it's important, I think, not only to try to protect more land or more parts of the ocean, but also get more involved in making sure that we're protecting areas that are important and get involved in trying to get involved in the political process and making sure that we're not just doing this superficially. We're not just protecting land for the sake of protecting land. We're actually protecting important areas. We also need to invest in aquatic research. So this is from the UN Sustainable Development Goals website, and they list that only about 1.2% of national research is spent on oceans. So I was just on the bus on the way over here, just doing a quick calculation. The James Webb Space Telescope, which is being launched in a few weeks, cost about $10 billion and it's going to last for, optimistically, but good day, hopefully it'll be 10 years. So it's about $1 billion per year being spent for science from the James Webb Telescope. The total budget from NOAA in the United States for investigating ocean research is $200 million. So we're spending about 5 times more per year on this one telescope than we're spending on studying the entire ocean, which isn't to say that we shouldn't be doing the telescope. I love that it's a thing. I'm getting excited when it actually launches, but I think we should also be trying to invest in the same level in oceans. Right now, we have a huge portion of our globe is underwater, and we know an incredible small amount about it. And these vessels, so this is the Amundsen, one of Canada's research vessels, are very expensive to run. So they cost them like $20,000 a day just to run these things. So it's difficult to collect it, and we've got a very small amount of money being spent on actually studying it, which means that we're gaining information at a much lower rate than we'd hope to try and understand how the ocean is changing. So thank you very much for your time. And I wanted to give a photo of the boundary of the terrestrial and aquatic world to lead into Rebecca's talk. And thanks for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. Question in the chat. Oh. Yep.
So that area in the north, where the ice cap melt and they want to put shipping routes through, why, if they want to do that, do you think it's not an immediate concern for protection?
Oh, yeah, it is of immediate concern. I think it's actually fantastic that we're protecting these large areas up north. And it's, in one case, it's actually, it's a great opportunity because it means we can protect these big areas before there's vested interests in them. So we can ensure that we have the protected spaces ahead of time. But it's not the only thing that we should be doing to protect. Like, if we notice like the Pacific coast, there's very limited amounts of protection there, even though it's got hugely important economic, ecological significance. So I don't think we should stop trying to protect the north. And like, as it opens up, it's going to come very important. Like there's going to be a lot of traffic trying to move through there very shortly. But we should also be trying to get more involved in protecting areas further south. Yep.
When we talk about climate change, we know that the risks are huge, and we know that there will be negative impacts. But I was thinking, in the Pacific, there have been salmon who can't get back to the river to spawn because of the rising temperatures. And as you were mentioning, that these predator fish can have huge impacts on a whole ecosystem. Do you think that the potential risk of climate change is underestimated?
I think that like the potential risk of climate change is unbounded. I don't think I'm not enough of a climate scientist to really even measure, weigh in on relative risks of things, but we do know currently we think it's small chances, but there is chances of big changes, things like the North Atlantic current slowing down substantially, which has been correlated with things like ice ages, So these kind of big changes are a substantial risk, but I don't think we actually have the framework to evaluate them effectively. I can't tell you what the most risky risk or the most substantial risk is right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big one of the big reasons why we should be trying to slow down climate change as much as possible as we can now is that the more we drive it, the bigger these long odds risks are of happening.
All the unknown.
Yes. Yep, Rebecca.
You mentioned this rat and cod, which
Yep.
I'm really interested. Is that the current hypothesis for why our Atlantic cod covering?
That's a very difficult question. It's probably the hypothesis I lean to the most, and that a similar kind of shift. So Sprat's not really dominant in the Newfoundland system. Capeland is sort of comparable. I think there might have been a similar change that kept cod down, but the collapse of cod, for reference, for probably everyone in the audience is probably too young to even have been born when cod collapsed. But in about 1990, cod, which was the most important stock in Newfoundland, dropped 2 orders of magnitude in about 2 years. So it dropped to 1% of its previous level in around 2 to 4 years. And it caused the shutdown of an entire fishery in the blink of an eye, like the collapse of an economic and social way of life very, very rapidly. So Canada rapidly stopped fishing it. So we did put a pretty strong moratorium. It wasn't a perfect moratorium. There's still fishing going on, but it was reduced. We never saw cod come back. Like cod, 3 decades on, had only bounced back a little bit around 2010. And even still, it's only back to about maybe 5% of where it was previously. So it's still one of the big mysteries of why this happened. Why is it not returned? And we think one of the things that might be driving it is this kind of food web feedback where other species have increased. They're now keeping cod from returning. But like we're saying, there's so many unknowns about the ocean that we can only observe like a tiny fraction of life in the ocean. We can only observe a small number of interactions. So there's a huge number of uncertainties about this. Yeah, it's a tough question, but it's a good question. Yep.
What do you think of like potential offshore farming?
You mean like aquaculture, you mean?
Yeah.
So I mean, for some species, it makes sense. So things like mussel aquaculture is probably some of the most sustainable resource development. And there was a great talk on this for fish that was broadcast on Fourth Space 2 weeks ago. Yeah. So things like mussel aquaculture, where we're growing the mussels, they're taking in phytoplankton, and in some ways they're actually cleaning up the water that we're dumping nitrates into, so that they actually are kind of helping purify the water that we've messed up, are probably overall a net win. Like I feel no compunction about eating mussels. I think they're like they're more sustainable than even things like a lot of agriculture. There are other forms of aquaculture that, things like salmon right now, they rely very heavily on us catching things like forage fish from the ocean to feed to the salmon. So they're not really a purely agricultural product. They're a farm, like they're closer to cattle, where we're taking one input and putting it into them. They also cause big ecosystem impacts on the area they're farmed in. So we're still trying to figure that out.
There's aquaculture on land.
Yeah.
But also on the shore.
Yeah.
But then there's like an offshore version, because I know that having, for example, salmon or any fish, there's a pile of like debris piling up at the bottom. So that's why like for offshore, there's a different area. They're looking at the water currents, how deep it is, and the actual device kind of syncs with high waves and all that.
Oh, okay.
Right. But like, I was thinking, for sure that wouldn't ever replace like actual big fisheries, but do you think that if this is developed like substantially and we can put more money towards it, like explain there's barely any money put towards like ocean research at all, if not farming. And then do you think that, say we can like target specific species that some markets really overfish, and we can potentially like develop that?
Yeah, I think it is. I hadn't actually really heard much of the offshore side. That's really interesting to hear about that. But it makes sense. It does definitely mitigate some of the impacts that they can have on nearshore areas. And actually, as an example of these kind of impacts they can have, I had a friend who was working on aquaculture in Newfoundland, looking at salmon pens, and what she found was that in the junk beneath the tanks, they were finding worms growing in it that had only ever been found on whale carcasses in the deep ocean. So somehow these worms were coming from the deep ocean and were colonizing this like salmon effluent and like radically changing the ecosystem. So I think these deep water pens are an interesting idea. I think if we can figure out effective ways of growing them that don't take as much like wild capture of other fish, it's going to be a pretty useful long-term solution. I think they're part of a broader sustainable food system.
They still have issues with them, because sometimes you have fish that escape.
Yeah.
And most of the time they're not like from this area. So
Yeah.
like how could be. populations. So they had issues where like that would change the entire list composition of the population.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting problem. It's one of, like, I think we still need quite a bit of research on to try and figure out the most sustainable way of doing this. But I think if we solve some of these problems, it is probably part of the long-term solution. Welcome. Any other questions? I didn't know if there's any questions from chat. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Maybe you want to study oceans, but I don't study oceans. Unfortunately, I'm just going to get my slides up here for a second. The slides have been slow today. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
it should be open. It's just like PowerPoint is.
So I'm Rebecca Tittler. I'm a forest ecologist by training. I also teach here in the geography department. Right now I'm teaching a course in sustainable forest management. I teach at the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability as well. I teach a biodiversity course, which some of you have taken. And if you haven't, if you're with the college, chances are good that you will be taking it in the future. So I'm actually not going to talk about biodiversity today, for those of you who will have to hear me talk about it for a whole semester at another time. Also I found that when I tried to incorporate biodiversity alongside forests, I think I would be here for a lot longer, and you all have lives to get back to. I'm also the coordinator and the academic advisor for the Loyola College. So if you're in sustainability studies or diversity studies, you'll hear from me often. And it's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. I can't see you online, but are we in slideshow mode online? I've done this teaching online thing and I've done the teaching in person thing. It's the hybrid thing that I'm kind of new at. So, okay, so I'm going to be talking about SDG 15, life on land. When I first started thinking about a course in SDGs, I thought, well, I don't do anything to do with the SDGs. But then, of course, life on land. Did I mention I'm a forest ecologist? Life on land, the subtext there is that we are supposed to be protecting, you'll see it in a minute, restoring and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managing our forests, combating desertification, halting and reversing land degradation, and halting biodiversity loss. So right in the first text of SDG 15, I teach classes on 2 of those things. So I figured we're good. Somehow the slides are changing here, but not here. Is that normal? Between the projector? Should be a slideshow, Mike.
I think you were.
Oh, right, there we go. So initially when I started thinking about this class, I thought, well, I'll go through all of these. Terrestrial ecosystems, what are we talking about? Forests, desertification, land degradation, and biodiversity loss. But as I said, I already teach 2 courses in just 2 of these topics, so there isn't time today. So what I'm going to talk about in the end is the sustainably managed forests part. So we're going to start with some what is a forest? What is sustainable management of forests? We're going to cover some whys. Why do we care? And then we're going to look at some hows. How are we going to, or what are some ideas for how we could sustainably manage our forests? It's really interesting here. I was just thinking how interesting it is that we're halting biodiversity loss here. We're not halting the loss of forests. We're sustainably managing the forests that we have. According to SDG 15, which is they're related, but I think that the wording is something to think about. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a forest? Everybody has an idea of what a forest looks like, right? You have an idea in your mind what a forest is. Oh, sorry, very slow. If I'd known it was going to be slow, I would have put way more on fewer slides. There we go. Okay. So I have some pictures of things that might be considered forests. This is an apple orchard. In your image, in your mind, do you think of this as a forest? Just think about it. What about this? Can't see it too well here in class because the light is weird. Can we turn the light off?
Yeah.
Over this. Is that a little bit better? This is a clear cut in Canada. Just think about it. Do you consider this a forest? Fit with your image? Some students who know me are nodding. What about this? Forest? It's a pine plantation. How about this? This is NDG. This is a Google Maps shot. Credit to Google. This is NDG right around the Loyola campus. And I don't know if you can see it here in class very well, but all of the parts that aren't houses, pretty much most of that is tree cover. Is that a forest? Officially, the United Nations defines, in their various documents, define forests pretty much along these lines as an area that's about 0.5, that's at least 0.5 hectares, that's 70 by 70 meters, at least 10% canopy cover, and trees that are at least 5 meters tall, or the capacity to reach this. It also has to be an area that's not under agricultural or other use. And this is according to UNEP and the FAO. So given this definition, we can look back at the 4 types of kind of tree dominated systems and think about, according to this definition, which of these are forests? Is the clear cut a forest according to this definition? It actually is, because although it's not 10% canopy cover and 5%, 5 meters tall at this time, it has the potential to reach that, unless we are going to change the use. So we're going to, instead of allowing this to regenerate as a forest or replanting it, we're going to plow this under and build houses, or we're going to have an agricultural field here, or we're going to have an open pit mine. If one of those things is going to happen, then this is no longer a forest. But if it's clear cut and in 2-3 years, it's going to be this high in aspen naturally in a lot of our forests, that's still considered officially to be forest. The residential area on the right, forest, it's over 10% canopy cover. It's 25 to 30% canopy cover. It's not considered to be a forest because it is primary use is residential. The apple orchard also is not considered to be a forest because its primary use is agricultural. It's a little bit controversial when you think of the plantation in comparison to the apple orchard, because the plantation actually officially is considered to be forest. We're growing the trees to cut them down, but we're not growing them to grow apples. So it's considered to be forest. So when we look at global statistics on forest loss and forest amounts and talk about deforestation, we have to keep in mind that this is what we mean by forest. Now we just talked about aquatic systems. So this is a forest stream. For those of you in the classroom, we can't see as well. So you can see that we have an aquatic system in the forest. You could argue that this is a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic ecosystem. It's all considered to be forest though, because we have the primary use of not agricultural, not urban forest. We have the trees. We do have a lot of feedbacks between the aquatic systems and the terrestrial systems. In this particular example, for example, we would have the trees dropping leaves and twigs and having nutrient input into the forest, protecting the aquatic system from UV damage, providing substrates and food for aquatic systems. We would have the aquatic system providing water also, right? And then we have a lot of species that will live part of their life in the water and part of it on land, a lot of animals, like mosquitoes, like a lot of frogs, etc. So there are close links between the aquatic systems and forest systems. There are also close links between marine systems and forest systems. Peter was asking about salmon having their migration patterns change due to global warming and no longer moving up the rivers to spawn. That's going to have an effect on our forests, because we found, for example, in BC, that the salmon actually feed nitrogen to the trees in the forest because they are caught in spawning by bears, who then bring them into the forest to eat. And then we have a transfer of nutrients from the ocean to the forest, allows our trees to grow big and strong. Okay, so we kind of know what a forest is, according to the United Nations, but there are lots of definitions of a forest. Forest means different things to different people, to different organisms. So you probably have an idea in your mind of what a forest is. And I think it's important to recognize that, just to understand what we're talking about when we're looking at statistics, but then to also understand and recognize that the forest has great meaning and various meanings for different peoples. Okay, so what's sustainable forest management? The UN again has defined forest management here as a dynamic and evolving concept intended to maintain and enhance the economic, social, and environmental values of all types of forests for the benefit of present and future generations. A little bit of vagueness built in there, dynamic and evolving concept, but we have our three spheres of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. I would simplify this to kind of a millennium ecosystem assessment type definition, where we can talk about managing a forest in such a way that the needs of future generations are not compromised by what we do today. And we can have tons of discussions about what we are managing for, what values of a forest, how we measure sustainability. Those are entire weeks of classes. You take my sustainable forest management class. We don't have time to get into it here. But you know, writ large, that's a very basic definition of what we're talking about. Why do we care? Well, in 2014, Robert Costanza and his colleagues published a paper that was actually a follow-up paper from a paper published in 1997 that tried to put an economic value on the world's ecosystems. And what they found is, I always say that if you really want to put an economic value or dollar value on the world's ecosystems, all you have to do is move to Mars and figure out how much it's going to cost you to live there. There's no oxygen on Mars to start with. The reason for that is that there are no photosynthetic organisms who are releasing oxygen for us to breathe. So right there, this is definitely a huge underestimate. But they came up with an estimate of $5.7 trillion US annually for our forests, about $1,300 per hectare per year. That's about 13% of the value of all of the ecosystems on Earth, according to this model, which looked specifically at 17 ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are things that we get from ecosystems, really simply put, and things that we can put, in this case, a dollar value on, so that we can use this kind of language to understand what we're talking about. A surprising number of things are made from wood. To start with, we usually think of paper, we think of timber, we think of building, but these are some of this is an infographic put out by the government of Ontario. Toothpaste actually contains wood products: soft ice cream, nail polish, towels, gum. Timber is kind of an obvious one. Protective gear. So these are just a few things that are made from wood. And when we think of forest management, we often think of wood products, not necessarily these, but we often think of wood products. What we might also think of is carbon. Forests sequester and store carbon. Sequestering carbon means that they take it out of the atmosphere and they make it into biomass. So plants, when they photosynthesize, what they do is they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they make it into a sugar that they then use to build more plant, right? So they're making into biomass. They're feeding all kinds of herbivores that might eat them, would then be feeding on those sugars and using that carbon. They're fixing carbon for the rest of us to use. And they're also storing it in the mass of the plant, but then also if we're talking about trees and other plants, they're storing it in the soil. More actually carbon is stored in the soil of forests than above ground. It's estimated that about 400 gigatons of carbon is stored in our forests. And this is mostly in the soils and vegetation part here. Forests also provide many, many other services. This is a list of ecosystem functions published by de Groot in 2002. And each of these functions provides services, a suite of services. So for example, gas regulation, climate regulation. Forests produce rain. Rainforests are called rainforests because they produce rain. The rainforests of Brazil produce rain systems that hit the coast of Africa. So trees and forests are involved in climate regulation. Disturbance prevention. The roots of trees and forests will help us to limit erosion, can control flooding, swells on the oceans. We had a picture of mangroves that can control storm damage or limit storm damage, etc. Water regulation and water supply. So we're controlling water levels. The roots of trees will absorb water and also filter the water so that we get better quality water, fresher water. Soil retention, they're holding the soil, preventing erosion. Soil formation, when trees lose their leaves, they're adding nutrients back into the soil this time of year. Those leaves drop to the ground, they're decomposed by decomposers, we get the formation of soil, for example. Regulation of nutrients in the soil, especially treatment of waste and pollution. So trees filter pollution. Pollination services, they provide habitat for pollinators and also for other species that might encourage pollinators to be better pollinators. There's a great paper, those of you in my biodiversity class have read it, that looks at how many flowers bees visit in agricultural fields when there is other natural habitat or forest close by. And what they find is that even controlling for a difference in the number of bees, the bees who are working closer to natural habitat are more likely to be disturbed by birds and other insects flying by, and so they'll move more. So a single bee will be a more efficient pollinator when we have natural habitat and forests close by. Biological control, Eric talked a little bit about top predators. When we think about biological control, we often think about agricultural systems. So we're controlling plant pests that might otherwise eat all of our crops. We need predators to control those pest species. Refugium function and nursery function. I'm not going to get a chance to talk about biodiversity, but forests provide habitat for breeding and habitat for the life of many organisms, including people. Food and raw materials, these are kind of obvious. Genetic resources and medicinal resources that help us to live better lives. A lot of our resources come initially from the forest. And then we have the ornamental, aesthetic, recreational, cultural, artistic, spiritual, and science and education services, some of which can be harder to put an economic value on, like the spiritual and the aesthetic, but are nonetheless hugely important. And I think that many people realized fundamentally the importance of forests and of our green spaces in a way that perhaps they hadn't before the pandemic. Last semester, I tell my students, go out and sit under a tree for 10 minutes. If you're feeling the weight of the world, just try to block it out and listen to the leaves. And we can't underestimate, it's hard to put a dollar value on that, but we can't underestimate the value of that either. So forests are really important to us and to other living things across the world. Forests are declining worldwide. This is data from 1990 to 2000 to 2020. So we have 1990 to 2000 in the first bars, the light green. 2000 to 2010 in the medium green, and then the dark green is 2010 to 2020. And we can see here that in parts of the world, in Asia, for example, and in Europe, we've seen increases in forest cover. In Asia, there have been huge afforestation, so huge planting projects in China, for example. In Europe, we're seeing some of the traditional pastoral landscapes where people would graze their sheep and their cattle freely, that they're no longer doing that because of modern agricultural practices, and so the forest is growing back. In Oceania and North America, we see little change, but we're still seeing huge losses in South America and in Africa. Worldwide, it's estimated that we've lost about 170 million hectares of forest since 1990, and about 0.9% of the forest carbon stocks have been lost. So we know what forests are, we know what sustainable forest management is, more or less. We know why forests are important. How can we manage our forests sustainably? These are just some ideas. Eric talked about protected areas. So the first thing that comes to many people's minds is let's just fence off, right? Let's just set aside some forest for protection and not let any logging occur there, not allow development, because most forest is lost due to agricultural development. So the question about agriculture is also of relevance to forests. If we can grow more of our food in the ocean, then we can maybe reduce the amount of forest that we're cutting down for our agricultural fields. Also, if we can eat a little lower down on the food chain, we can likewise limit the loss of forest due to agricultural expansion. Other big causes of forest loss include mining, oil and gas, and urbanization. But if we protect forests in specifically protected areas, then we're not going to develop it, presumably. That's one way that we can limit deforestation and allow for our forests to live their natural lives. We can also manage for diversity. And this is a theme that comes up over and over again in my own work, is the importance of diversity in all kinds of ways. This is the spruce budworm. This is a native insect, native here to Quebec, that eats the buds of balsam fir, which is another native tree species, early in the spring. It will also eat the buds of white spruce. It's called the spruce budworm rather than the balsam fir budworm because spruce is important industrially in Canada, whereas balsam fir isn't. So when humans thought about, the greatest damage that this insect could do, they thought of spruce, not fir. But I'm sure it has other names in other languages. Anyhow, this is our little spruce budworm. So if we have a stand that is really dominated by spruce and fir, when the budworm comes through, every 30 years or so, there's a peak budworm outbreak. We could end up with stand level disturbance here, right? Where almost all of the trees here are defoliated. Doesn't mean that they're all dead. Spruce budworm, it usually takes 2 or 3 outbreaks to kill a tree, but it definitely weakens the trees, increases the risk of fire because we've got all this these dry needles and fuel for a fire. If, on the other hand, we have a diverse forest here on the right, we've got some spruce, some fir in there, but it's not all spruce and fir. Then we can maintain our forest. We can maintain our forest functions. This forest on the right is still photosynthesizing. The one on the left, not so much. All of the functions that a forest provides can be better provided by the forest on the right than by the one on the left here. And the diversity, the presence of healthy standing trees will also presumably help our suffering trees, the spruce and the fir, to recover more quickly. So we can manage for diversity. What we tend to do is the opposite. We tend to have large multinational companies that are focused on a few products. We have a few species that are good for those products. And so the focus is on growing Here in Quebec, for example, let's grow spruce, right? We're going to grow white spruce. We get rid of the fir because it's not interesting to us. We're just going to grow, as much of whatever feeds our supply chain as possible. And so we don't tend to manage for diversity, but we should be. We need to listen to and empower Indigenous voices. There's an increasing body of literature that finds that Indigenous managed forests tend to be more sustainably managed. Indigenous forest peoples have lived in and alongside their forest for millennia. They tend to have a deeper understanding of how the forest works. They tend to have more diverse uses as well. This is just an example. This is the Menominee Forest Reservation in Wisconsin. And it doesn't show up too well in the class, but you can see it online. The outline of the Menominee Forest is quite obvious, right? All green here. And then everything outside it, there's some forest, but it's definitely not doing so well. The Menominee have been managing their forest. They have a sawmill since 1850. They have been managing the same patch of land, cutting from one end to the other and then moving back, cutting from one end to the other, not taking every tree, paying attention to the health of the individual trees, paying attention to the natural age structure of the forest, paying attention to diversity and species diversity. Places where we have done this, you can see outside of the reservation, not doing so well. Inside of the reservation, they're somehow managed to continue to live off this forest, producing timber out of the forest, but maintaining a healthy forest at the same time. We need to involve local communities in management. This recommendation is based on the assumption that forest-dependent communities have a greater interest in managing local forests sustainably than do external parties, multinational companies, etc. If you're a big company, I won't name any, but if you're a big multinational company and you clear cut an entire area, you're not worried about the regeneration. If the forest there doesn't come back really well, you can go somewhere else, right? And log there and you'll be fine. If you're a local community and your livelihood depends on your local forest, then the livelihood of your children probably also depends on your local forest. And presumably there's a much greater incentive to manage the forest sustainably. Now, this isn't simple and it doesn't always work according to textbook rules. A lot of research has found that often this community-based management works better if you have an honest broker who is somebody external who can provide advice, but more than that, kind of facilitation services, right, to help the community figure out the kinds of conflicts that can come up. Anyone who's interested in a great paper on the nitty-gritties of community-based management, there's some work done out of Haiti that is really interesting case studies. But in general, community-based forest management is something that will likely lead to more sustainably managed forests. I didn't mean Haiti, I meant Honduras. Okay, we can manage adaptively. This is something that we should be thinking about across the board, not just for forests, but especially in an uncertain climate future. We need to learn from our mistakes and we need to build this learning structure into our management structure. So according to an adaptive management type scenario, what we're doing is we're testing. We're trying out, setting a plan, trying out a strategy, monitoring the forest as we go through, evaluating the results of that monitoring, and then using those results to guide our movement forward. So we set in place some kind of plan, we monitor how it's going, we evaluate how it's going, we adapt our plan, we change it, we replan, we start the cycle again. We need to be doing this on a 5, max 10-year cycle at this point because the world is changing quickly. What about certification? Do these symbols look familiar? So if you turn your notebooks over, they might have a PEFC or an FSC symbol on the back. The certification processes were spearheaded in Rio 1992 as an attempt to limit the loss of forest and forest degradation in the tropics. The idea being that we need to create a market of people who care and a certification system so that people can tell when they're buying forest products, whether it comes from a sustainably managed forest or not. The idea is a good one. FSC and PEFC, they are nonprofit organizations that are basically hired. So a company or an organization that wants to be certified or have their product certified, they will pay the certification body to evaluate their practices and hopefully earn certification. So we're having the certification bodies are independent, right? It's not that you're buying and you're definitely going to get, get the certification if you just put in the money. But the fact is that certification programs, the success has been limited for a couple of reasons. One is that it's entirely market dependent. And at a certain point, like pretty much now, the market is flooded. As many people who care about certified product or buying certified products, and then that's the limit, right? If the rest of the world doesn't care, then there's no market, there's no incentive for companies to pay for certification if they can sell their products without being certified, right? Another big issue is that because it's expensive, especially FSC certification. So FSC certification is the most stringent. They will send people out to your sites where you have logged to check on how your trees are growing back. They will be on site checking the actual practices, what's happening on the ground, very stringent. There are requirements to involve Indigenous peoples, for example, in forest management. Here in Quebec, there was a company that lost their FSC certification, not because the Indigenous people in the area disagreed with what they were doing, because they refused to come to the table. So if you can't engage with Indigenous communities, done, no certification. So great, really stringent, very expensive, because you have to pay all those people who are going out in the field and checking, who are coming to the meetings to make sure there's representation. And what that means is that the companies that can afford to be certified are the ones that are already rich. They're the big multinationals. So that small companies who might do a greater diversity of things with the forest, might manage more for sustainability or for diversity, might be more community-based. It's not that their practices are necessarily less sustainable, but they're much less likely to be able to afford to apply for certification. Now, the PEFC certification is really a suite of certifications were developed to address this issue, and more geared towards smaller organizations, smaller companies, with the possibilities of having smaller forest owners or forest managers band together so that they can, a few small companies or forest owners can band together to be certified. So this has filled some of the gap, but there are still issues, definitely, and the market dependence is still an issue. So, and what we've seen, in fact, since 1992, I would click back if I could get the slides quickly, but what we've seen is that if you remember that forest loss graph with the bars, we haven't seen a decline in deforestation in the tropics since 1992. The other great idea that came out of 1992 out of Rio was the RED Plus programs, RED programs. The idea here was that, oops, sorry, this text is wrong. So the idea here was that the richer companies or countries would pay local communities in the tropics, for example, usually in the tropics in the global south, to conserve their forest. So in parts of the tropical forest is being degraded and lost because people have real daily needs. They need wood to heat their houses and to feed their families. So the idea was, if we can address those issues of poverty, we can pay people to maintain their forest instead of to degrade it. Then maybe that will be a great tool to halt deforestation and forest loss in impoverished areas in the global south. It hasn't really worked. It's been hugely criticized as really the rich coming in and telling those who are less advantaged what to do, right? And saying you can't log your forest because Coca-Cola here, who's going to keep emitting as much as they want, they're going to offset their emissions by paying for you not to have access to your forest resources. So there have been huge issues there. There were riots at times, and it hasn't. There are some success stories. There have been some successes of REDD+ programs, but overall, it's been hugely problematic. The idea being that really those who have benefited from the degradation of the forests have made their money, and now they're just going to give a little bit of that money so that others can't do the same. And this is an issue that I don't know if you've been following COP26. There was a big pledge signed by most of the countries in the world pledging to halt deforestation. There was a big chunk of money given to Indigenous forest management. We'll see where that goes. I'm watching very carefully. For Canada, officially, according to the definition of the forest, we have lost almost no forest recently. So for us to pledge to halt deforestation, that's an easy one for us, low-hanging fruit. But if we're going to halt deforestation in the tropics, which are huge carbon sinks, then we're going to have to think really creatively. We're going to have to work really hard at listening to a diversity of voices, which we haven't always been good at doing. And we'll see where it goes. So general take-home messages: forests are crucial to life as we know it on Earth. Forest cover is declining across much of the world. We're also seeing degradation of forests, which I haven't had a chance to talk about, but forest loss is just we're replacing forest with something else. That's pretty straightforward. Forest degradation is the loss of function of a forest. So if a forest that naturally has a very thick undergrowth suddenly has no undergrowth at all, it's still a forest, but it's a degraded forest. It's not functioning the way that it would have otherwise. Sustainable forest management will require diversification. It'll require diversification of methods, management methods. It'll require a diversity of voices. It requires us to listen to the expertise of those whose expertise we don't usually listen to. It requires species diversity, age structure diversity. It requires diversification of our industry in terms of how we're using the forest. It also, like anything sustainable, if we're talking about limiting forest loss, limiting resource loss in general, we need to talk about limiting consumption, right? Not halting consumption, limiting overconsumption. And that would go a long way towards limiting our forest loss and degradation. That is some of my course in 20 minutes. Thank you for listening. I'd love to take any questions that you have. And I'm sorry if I talk fast, it really is a whole 13 weeks. Any questions? Yeah, Olivier.
Well, like all climate change and all that, of course we need to preserve and restore our forests, but do you see like a growing importance in cities to build urban forests, considering that cities are literal heat islands?
Yes, absolutely. So I put the picture of the city up there on purpose because we do talk about the urban forest that may not fit under the UN's definition of a forest because it's urban first. But we do talk about the urban forest, and the urban forest is the trees that are in the city. And yes, they are increasingly important. We need to plant them wherever we can, whenever we can. It's not necessarily simple. So there are a lot of issues that we have to deal with, like potential damage to property, right? If trees fall down with increasing storms. I'm always ready for the next ice storm because that ages me, I know. But ready for a tree to fall through my living room. That doesn't mean that I don't want to have a tree. But we do need to address those issues. In general, I feel like in Montreal, there's been a big push, and not just Montreal, but lots of places, there's been a big push to increase forest cover in cities. And for the most part, it's all good. We can see the effects on heat islands. For example, right away. There are on property values, there are issues of gentrification that we need to pay attention to. When we plant trees in low-income neighborhoods, we increase the value of the properties there. And so that tends to lead to gentrification. We say we just need to plant, 30% more trees across the board, all neighborhoods, and then maybe we won't have that effect quite so much. But there are some subtleties and some issues that we need to deal with. But in general, yes, if we have space to do it, we should be planting trees. And in Montreal, if you're driving along the highway or take the shuttle bus downtown, you'll notice that there is a lot of tree planting going on, and there are lots of great people who are doing some wonderful work there. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, well, with gentrification, I think it's obvious that like the wealthier neighborhoods have a higher diversity of whatever plant and trees. So it's like, I think there was a class with you, or maybe part of our scale, but we went to check trees on the street.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about adding diversity, you don't want to look at just the species, right? You want to look at like the genus, because if you have 4 maple trees, they're still as vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like 4 different species of maple.
Yeah. So Olivia was in my my biodiversity class where we go outside in January. That's a warning. I measure trees in the streets here in NDG. We talk about the importance of not just trees, but of a diversity of trees. And that's that theme of diversity again, for the same reasons. We need for our urban forests to be resilient and to be resistant, especially in the face of, all of the uncertainty coming with climate change, of more drastic weather events. Insect invasions, we're seeing right now, the emerald ash borer is knocking out 30% of the trees in some neighborhoods, which is something that we could have avoided if we hadn't planted 30% of the trees in some neighborhoods as one species. The city of Montreal is doing better. One of the streets that we look at when my biodiversity class comes out is Patricia, right over here in NDG, that used to be really dominated by ash, and what they've done in taking those trees down, they really planted a whole different selection of species. We also need a diversity of age structures in our forests. If we have all of our trees that are the same age, then they're all going to die at the same time, and we're going to go from a forested city to a city without trees, relatively quickly. So yes, we need diversity in our urban forests as well. Here at Loyola, a couple of years ago, we planted 190 trees, which was great. And we planted a huge number of species, all native species, but really focused on, getting as many different species of trees in as we could. And some boroughs, some neighborhoods, some areas are doing better there than others. There's a neighborhood near where I live that being recorded, so I'm not going to call anybody out, but that has planted a ton of trees this summer. They're all Princeton Gold Norway maples. So Norway maples, for starters, are not native. Secondly, they're invasive, meaning they actually have a negative effect on native species. Thirdly, because they are a cultivar, they're Princeton Gold, they're actually all the same tree genetically. They're all taken from the same genetic stock, right? So we basically planted maybe, any tree is better than no tree, but if you're going to plant a tree, think about diversity, genetic diversity, species diversity, age structure diversity. Yeah.
Any chance, when you have a smooth bugler outbreak, what is the net impact on soil moisture?
Oh, really good question.
Trees go into that sort of metabolism drops.
Yeah, so when a tree has no more leaves, obviously its metabolism, I don't have actual numbers for you, but obviously its metabolism slows down, right? Because it's not bringing energy and it can't photosynthesize without the leaves. So until it grows that back, it's in an injured state, right? In terms of soil drying, there's just the effect of more sunlight reaching the soil as well. Right. We do have all those insects and all of their feces on the ground, so they do fertilize the soil to some extent and return some of the carbon that's taken from the trees, from the needles that they eat, back to the soil. In their feces, they do release some into the atmosphere as they breathe out, but they also return some to the soil. I mean, it's a natural cycle. It's just that with climate change, we're seeing warmer climates benefit a lot of insects. So that we're seeing, you know, that the insects are doing better. At the expense of so yeah, we should have soil drying, but I don't have numbers for you there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's for certain that a tree that has no needles is definitely not performing its functions the same way that a tree with needles is.
Yeah. You talk about how much carbon is sequestered within the boreal forest and even north of the boreal forest. Is a huge amount.
Yeah, in the permafrost, there's a huge amount of carbon stored. That was in one of the figures there.
Yeah, and I think to keep those insect infestations check, you need migrating birds like warblers.
Yeah.
It's all the different parts of the tree.
Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit about how important it is to keep
The balance, yeah. One of the reasons that we are expecting spruce budworm outbreaks, for example, to be worse in the future is that the budworms are eaten by the wood warblers. The wood warblers are migratory. And so as the climate warms here in Quebec, the budworm are coming out earlier. The trees are also budding slightly earlier. What's not happening is the birds are not getting here much earlier because they're time their migration based on photoperiod, and the photoperiod is not changing, right? So that they are increasingly not here for the peak of the budworm, so not able to control that as much as they would have, 50 years ago. So as with aquatic systems, we see the importance of food webs, we see the importance of predators and kind of maintaining some kind of balance. It's going to be really interesting. As a biologist, it's really interesting looking, to see, it'll be interesting to see what happens, but we're looking at a lot of changes and unpredictable changes, right? There are huge feedbacks, some of which we can have a handle on, some of which will catch us off guard and we won't have predicted for sure. Anybody else? Can I check the chat? Oh wait, I have two in the chat, hang on. I have a multitude of computers in front of me, so. Nope, I'm good.
I'm not seeing anything in the chat, Rebecca, but.
Okay, great. I just had your messages in the chat. So I guess with that, I'll hand it back to Peter. Thank you so much. It's nice to see you all.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Eric. Yeah, a little bit depressing, when we think of how important it is to hear bird song or to eat fish. It really was a wake-up call. So really important talk. So thank you very much. Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say how spoiled we are and how lucky we are to have had access to those presentations. Rebecca and Eric, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And, those students that are there, thank you so much for being there. I think it is a busy.
There are many off camera as in the camera. So.
That's right. Okay. we have a tiny window view onto what's going on in there. But anyway, as you know, for those students who had to miss today's lecture, it is available on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, Eric and Rebecca, for allowing us to stream your presentations. Check out Concordia University's Force Space YouTube channel, and you'll see those presentations there as the first video you'll encounter. And we're so happy to join you again next week. So I think on that note, we'll say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your class. And thanks again. Bye, Peter. Take good care. Bye.